You smell smoke before you see the fire. It's 1453. Constantinople. The walls around you are stone, ancient, cold, unyielding. But the doors are wood, and wood burns. You hear boots. Heavy, deliberate. They echo down corridors that once carried only prayer. Voices rise in a language you don't understand, sharp and guttural, cutting through the hymns you've whispered every dawn for 15 years. Down the hall, a sister screams. Then silence, the kind that feels like a hand over your mouth. This is not history. This is terror, still warm. You are a bride of Christ. Your vows were supposed to be armor. Chastity, obedience, enclosure. These were meant to make you invisible, untouchable, holy. But empires don't care about vows. They care about land, power, bodies. The fire climbs the wooden door. You press yourself against stone and ask the question no one will answer. What happens to women sworn to God when the world outside stops believing in that God? But to understand the fire, you must first understand the silence that came before it. Before the fire, there was rhythm. Wake before dawn. Kneel on cold stone. Sing the hours. Matins. Lauds. Vespers. Compline. Your life was a loop of devotion, predictable as breath. The convent was a fortress, not of soldiers, but of silence. High walls kept the world out. Chastity kept desire out. Obedience kept rebellion out. You were safe because you were invisible. In Christian Europe, a nun's vows were armor. To be virgin was to be untouchable. To be enclosed was to be protected. To be obedient was to be holy. The world outside could rage and burn, but within these walls, you were consecrated. Sacred, beyond the reach of men. But here's the paradox no one warned you about. The very things that made you safe in one world made you vulnerable in another. Virginity, enclosure, obedience. These were not universal truths. They were Christian constructs. And when an empire that did not recognize your God arrived at your gates, those vows stopped being shields. They became targets. When your entire identity is built on invisibility, what happens when you are suddenly violently seen? The answer came on a spring morning in 1453, when the Ottoman cannons shattered the walls of Constantinople, and everything you thought you knew about safety collapsed with them. May 29th, 1453. It wasn't just a city that fell. It was a world. Constantinople, the jewel of Eastern Christianity, the last remnant of Rome, crumbled in a single day. But this isn't about emperors or treaties. This is about what it feels like when the map beneath your feet is redrawn while you sleep. Convents scattered across Greece, the Balkans, Anatolia, the Levant, places where women had prayed for centuries, woke up in a different empire. Church bells, once the heartbeat of Christian time, went silent. In their place, the call to prayer 5 times a day in a language that wasn't yours to a God you didn't recognize. The Ottoman Empire didn't just conquer land. It conquered meaning. Borders bled into new shapes. Administrators arrived with ledgers and taxes. Conquest is cold like that, bureaucratic, methodical, indifferent. Your faith became a legal category. Your convent became taxable property. Your body became a resource to be managed. And the cruelest part? No one was coming to save you. No crusade. No rescue. No papal army riding over the hills. You were alone now, locked inside stone fortresses that once symbolized God's protection, but now felt more like tombs. So what happens to the women left behind when the empire stops caring if they live or disappear? Everyone knows about the devsherm, the blood tax. Christian boys, taken from their villages every few years, converted to Islam, trained as janissaries, elite soldiers of the Sultan. It was brutal, yes. A violation, yes. But history remembers them. There are records, paintings, chronicles. These boys became men with names, ranks, legacies. Some rose to power. Their suffering was documented. Their transformation was visible. But what about the girls? History doesn't talk about them. Not because they weren't taken, but because what happened to them was never meant to be recorded. Some are collected for Ottoman households, not as wives, as servants, invisibles. They scrubbed floors in estates where their own languages were forbidden. Others were left behind in convents that could no longer protect them, trapped in institutions that had become shadows of themselves, places where the walls still stood, but the safety had bled out. Here's the grotesque contrast. Boys were turned into soldiers. There was a kind of honor in that, however twisted. But girls? Girls were turned into ghosts. The sons were remembered. The daughters were erased. And the ones who stayed inside the convent walls, the ones who thought they were safe because they had taken vows, what happened to them when those walls stopped meaning anything to the men who now control the land outside? Under Ottoman rule, the convent became two things at once: refuge and trap. For some women, it was the only safe place left. A way to escape forced marriage to a man twice your age. A way to avoid conversion at knife point. A way to dodge conscription into some Ottoman household where you disappear into servitude, your name forgotten before your body grew cold. So you took the veil, not out of devotion, but out of desperation. But for others, the convent became a prison with stone walls and no exit. The Ottomans allowed Christian institutions to exist under the millet system, a kind of legal tolerance. You could keep your faith, your churches, your convents, but barely. No new construction, no loud bells, no public processions, no visibility. You could pray, yes, but only if you whispered. The convent survived, but survival isn't the same as living. You were watched. Always. Ottoman officials could arrive at any moment to inspect, to tax, to remind you that your existence was conditional, permitted, revocable. Safety and suffocation, it turns out, are sometimes the same thing. And survival under these conditions came with a price, one measured not in blood or flames, but in something far quieter and far crueler: money. The jizya, the tax non-Muslims paid just to exist. For individuals, it was humiliating. For convents, it was impossible. Nuns lived communally. They owned nothing. No land to sell. No dowries to draw from. No income except the occasional charity from villages that were themselves being bled dry. And yet, every year, the tax collectors came. So the abbess would kneel, not in prayer this time, but before an Ottoman official, hands trembling, holding whatever coins the convent had scraped together, negotiating, bribing, begging for one more year of existence. Imagine that. Imagine having to purchase the right to pray. Your faith, once the center of your identity, the thing you gave your entire life to, reduced to a line item in an imperial ledger. Your devotion commodified. Your soul for sale. What does that do to you? When holiness becomes a transaction, when every prayer you whisper is conditional on a payment you may not be able to make next year. Economic degradation is spiritual erasure. Slowly, quietly. It doesn't burn you alive. It just drains you until there's nothing left. And when the money finally ran out, when there were no more coins to offer, no more bribes to give, the walls came down. Not all convents survived. Some were abandoned, left to rot, stone by stone, as ivy claimed the chapels and rain dissolved the frescoes. Others were repurposed, turned into mosques, stables, private estates. The altar where you once knelt became a storage room. The sanctuary where you sang hymns became a pen for livestock. But the real tragedy isn't what happened to the buildings. It's what happened to the women inside when those walls came down. Where did they go? Some fled to remote mountain monasteries, places so hidden, so inaccessible, that even the Ottoman Empire didn't bother with them. They survived, yes, but in isolation so complete it felt like burial. Others were absorbed into villages. They took off the veil, married out of necessity, bore children they never wanted. Their identities as brides of Christ dissolved like salt in water. They became invisible again, but this time not by choice. A few converted. We don't talk about them much. History prefers martyrs to survivors. The tone here is geological, like watching a river dry up. Slow, irreversible, tragic in its inevitability. Because losing your home is one thing, but losing your purpose, the reason you wake up, the meaning that holds your life together, that's a different kind of death. And it doesn't kill you all at once. It erodes you. 6 centuries. 600 years of conditional existence, of living only because you made yourself small enough not to be noticed. This is what it did to the women who remained. You stopped singing. Once, your voice carried through stone halls and hymns that made the walls hum. Now you whisper. Even in prayer, you self-censor. You learn to make your devotion quiet, compressed, invisible. The bells stopped ringing. Too loud, too public, too Christian. So time itself became muted. You lost the rhythm that once structured your days. Prayer became a secret act, something done behind closed doors, in the dark where no one could see. Faith, which was supposed to be proclaimed, became something you hid, like shame. Silence was survival. But silence is also a kind of death. It suffocates you slowly. You don't notice at first. But over decades, over generations, it changes you. You stop expecting rescue. You stop imagining freedom. You internalize the violence. You become complicit in your own erasure. This is what empires do. They don't just conquer your land. They colonize your mind. They make you believe that your smallness is safety, that your silence is wisdom, that submission is survival. It's gaslighting on a civilizational scale. But not everyone accepted it. Some refused to shrink. Some refused to whisper. And they paid for it. Not all nuns accepted their fate. History loves to paint them as passive, kneeling, weeping, waiting for God to intervene. But some didn't wait. Some fought back. There are documented cases. Nuns who hid refugees during Ottoman raids, sheltering families in cellars and behind false walls. Abbesses who forged documents, baptismal records, death certificates, to protect young girls from being taken into Ottoman households. Convents that became underground networks for Christian rebellion, especially during the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s. These women passed messages, smuggled weapons, hid revolutionaries. They turned their holy spaces into war rooms. The tone shifts here, from tragic to defiant, because even in chains, some refuse to be silent. Even under surveillance, some refuse to shrink. They looked at 6 centuries of submission and said, "Not me. Not today." But defiance has a cost, and the cost was brutal. This isn't martyrdom in the romantic sense. No glorious deaths, no statues erected in their honor. This is the kind of resistance that gets you erased. The kind that leaves no record except a gap in the monastery log. A cell that suddenly sits empty. A name that stops appearing in letters. So what happened to the ones who fought back? They disappeared. What happened to the nuns who resisted? They vanished, taken in the night. No trial, no announcement, just gone. One day they were leading prayers, and the next day their cell was empty. Their bed untouched. Their prayer book left open to a page they would never finish reading. Some were accused of conspiracy, collaboration with rebels, treason against the Sultan. The charges didn't need to be true. They just needed to be useful. Others were simply erased. Their names crossed out of monastery logs. Their letters burned. Their existence scrubbed from record as if they had never been born. This is horror through absence. History doesn't always leave bodies. Sometimes it just leaves gaps. Silences where there should be voices. Blank spaces where there should be names. It's forensic, like investigating a cold case centuries later and finding nothing but dust and rumors. A whispered story passed down through generations. There was a nun here once. She helped someone escape. They came for her. We never saw her again. No grave, no memorial, no proof she ever existed, except the hole her absence left behind. So how do you remember what was never allowed to be recorded? How do you mourn a woman whose name you don't even know? Most of what we know comes from fragments. Letters smuggled to Rome, written in trembling script by abbesses who knew they might not live to see a reply. Oral histories passed down through generations, stories told by grandmothers to granddaughters in kitchens, never written, always whispered. Annotations in the margins of Ottoman tax records, a crossed-out name, a note about a convent no longer operational, a line item that suddenly stops appearing. This is the archive of whispers. Because the Ottoman Empire didn't just control bodies. It controlled memory. It decided what got recorded and what got erased, what was worth documenting and what could be safely forgotten. This is epistemological violence, the destruction not of people, but of the evidence that they ever mattered. What does it mean to be written out of history while you're still alive? To know that when you die, there will be no record of your suffering? That your pain will dissolve into silence, and future generations will never know you existed? It's a second death, worse than the first. And when these women, bleeding, desperate, terrified, sent letters begging for help, where did those letters go? To Rome, to the Vatican, to the seat of Christendom itself. And Rome did nothing. The letters were written in trembling hands, ink smudged by tears. Greek nuns, Armenian mothers, young girls taken from convents, they all wrote to Rome. They begged, they prayed, they described the blood, the chains, the screams echoing through harem walls. They sent these letters across mountains and seas, clutching to the belief that the church, their church, would answer. But Rome was silent, not because it didn't know, not because the letters never arrived. Rome was silent because it had made a choice. While Eastern Christians were being auctioned like livestock in Istanbul's markets, the Vatican was consumed by its war with Protestantism. All resources, all attention, all mercy funneled into European politics. The Ottoman question was inconvenient, distant, complicated, so the letters piled up in Vatican archives. Unread, unanswered, forgotten. Imagine that betrayal. You cry out to God through his representatives on earth and hear nothing, not even the courtesy of acknowledgement. You are sacrificed not by enemies, but by your own faith's indifference. This was not theology. This was abandonment. And so the nuns stopped writing. They stopped waiting. And they did what the abandoned always do. They survived alone. They survived alone. And some survive by converting. But do not rush to judgment. Do not reduce their choice to simplicity. Because conversion under the Ottoman system was never one thing. It existed in a gray zone so vast and so suffocating that the word choice itself begins to collapse. Some are forced, blades to throats, threats whispered over children's cradles. Convert or watch them die. That is not choice. That is terror wearing the mask of decision. Others converted because hunger is its own kind of violence. Because being Christian meant higher taxes, fewer rights, social death. Because survival is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just slow, grinding poverty that erodes faith like water on stone. And others? They were manipulated, promised safety, promised status, told that Islam would free them from shame, from their past, from the weight of what had been done to their bodies. Told that rebirth was possible, if only they would say the words. Was it betrayal? Or was it the only door left open in a burning room? Trauma does not ask for your moral clarity. It asks, what would you have done? And the answer is always more complicated than you want it to be. But even survival has consequences. And those consequences stretched across generations. And then there were the daughters who never were. Not the nuns who converted. Not the ones who died. But the girls who came after. The ones who would have taken vows. Who would have lived in quiet devotion behind convent walls. Who would have carried forward a spiritual lineage centuries old. They never got the chance. Convents were raised. Rebuilt as mosques, as barracks, as nothing. The ones that survived existed in shadows, illegal or barely tolerated, always one raid away from extinction. To become a nun was to paint a target on your family. To choose God openly was to choose danger. So the girls married instead, or converted, or lived silent, faithless lives, not because they stopped believing, but because belief had nowhere to grow. This is a loss you cannot measure in bodies. It is the loss of vocation. The severing of a sacred thread. Entire generations of women who might have become mystics, teachers, healers, erased not by death, but by the slow suffocation of possibility. A lineage cut, a calling silenced, a future that never came. But even in that silence, something refused to die. Somewhere, against all logic, the thread held. But some refused to die. Against every law of history, against 6 centuries of conquest and coercion and collapse, some convents survived. Not many, not most, but enough. In the mountains of Greece, where stone walls still bear scorch marks from Ottoman raids. In Bulgaria, where nuns hid manuscripts in wells and prayed in whispers. In Lebanon, where ancient monasteries clung to cliffs like acts of defiance. They survived. The women who kept them alive were not heroes in the way we imagine heroes. They did not lead armies or write manifestos. They simply refused to let the flame go out. They taught in secret. They copied scriptures by candlelight. They sang hymns in languages older than empires, languages the conquerors could not erase. Walk into those monasteries today, and you will feel it, the weight of survival. The smell of incense and old stone. The flicker of candles that have been lit in unbroken succession for 600 years. It is fragile. It is quiet. It is not victory, but it is a kind of miracle. And yet, survival always has a price. A cost paid in silence, in compromise, in wounds that never fully healed. So we must ask, what did it take to keep that flame alive? To survive, they swallowed their screams. They bowed their heads when soldiers passed. They paid taxes designed to humiliate them. They baptized children in secret and buried their dead without markers. They learned to smile through shame. They learned to forget because remembering was too heavy to carry. Trauma does not end when the violence stops. It burrows into the body. It passes through generations like a whispered curse. The daughters of survivors inherit silence. The sons inherit rage. Entire communities learn to flinch before they are even struck. And the questions, the theological wounds, remain open. Did God abandon us? Were we unworthy? Or were we the test he gave the world? The suffering that proved humanity's indifference? Eastern Christianity still carries this weight. In the liturgies, in the icons painted with faces too sad to be holy, in the prayers that sound less like worship and more like mourning. Survival is not the same as healing. Endurance is not the same as peace. They kept the flame alive, but the cost was their own burning. And that fire, that quiet immolation, still smolders in the bones of their descendants. So we must ask, who remembers this? Who carries the dead of their suffering? We inherited their silence, and we kept it. This history, this grotesque, centuries-long tragedy, has been buried under layers of political convenience and collective amnesia. It is rarely taught, rarely named, rarely mourned in the way it deserves. Why? Because it complicates narratives. Because it exposes hypocrisies on all sides. Because to remember it fully would require accountability from institutions that prefer myth over truth. The Ottoman Empire has defenders who call it pluralistic, enlightened, a model of coexistence. The Church has archives it will not open. The West has wars it justified with selective compassion. So the nuns disappeared twice. Once into the harems, and again into the silence of history. And when this story is remembered, it is often weaponized, used to fuel hatred, to justify modern violence, to pit faith against faith in wars that echo the past but learn nothing from it. But forgetting is not healing. Silence is not peace. To refuse to speak their names, to honor their suffering, to sit with the horror of what was done, that is not mercy. That is erasure. We owe them more than that. We owe them the weight of truth, the discomfort of memory, the courage to look directly at what survival cost. Because the past is never truly past. And the patterns, they're still here. What do we owe them? Not revenge, not monuments built on hatred, not the weaponization of their suffering into new cycles of cruelty. We owe them memory, full and unflinching. We owe them the truth of what survival cost. We owe the nuns who resisted and the nuns who converted the same dignity, because both lived through hell and neither deserved to be there. We owe the girls who never became nuns the recognition of future stolen. We owe the women who kept convents alive in shadows the honor they were denied in daylight. And we owe ourselves something too, the courage to look at history's cruelty without flinching, to name the systems that allowed it, to understand that evil is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is bureaucratic, theological, economic. Sometimes it wears the mask of civilization. To remember is not to seek vengeance. It is to refuse to let cruelty become invisible. It is to say, This happened. These women existed. Their suffering mattered. Somewhere, in a mountain monastery older than empires, a candle still burns. The flame flickers. The stone walls hold centuries of prayers. The air smells of incense and survival. No one is there, but the light has not gone out.